Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. Today we are going to do a bit of a basic deep dive into a topic I've been wanting to tackle for quite a while, the features of the head. We're going to start with the nose. This will be a beginner-friendly lesson where we'll cover the process of sculpting and the anatomy of the nose. So let's get into it. First, let me explain some of the materials I'll be using. We need something to sculpt on, an armature is what we call that, and we'll be using this very simple wooden board with nails nailed into it as such. For this exercise, we really don't need a lot in terms of armature, and a simple board like this will do the job just fine. As you can see here, I have the board on an upright easel. You could use something like this to get a front view on your sculpture, of course, or you could construct some small triangles to the back of the board, or you could even hang the board vertically on a wall. Either way is going to be fine, but we need to be able to get the board upright as well as being able to lay it flat down on a table. Here are the tools I'll be using. It's a mix of tools from Kemper Tools, Sculpture House and Tiranti. And links to all of these tools can be found in my FAQ post over on Patreon, which is free. Tools are more of an extension of your hand, your mind and your hand. And you don't really need any specific tools for this exercise, though a small modeling tool won't hurt for when we need to add small amounts of clay into very specific places. The clay I'll be using is a simple terracotta clay. It's water-based and rather smooth. I like it because it's easy to work with and fast. Oil-based clays will work as well, but require a bit more setup as they should be heated up before use to make them softer. To keep the clay from drying, we'll spray it with water every now and then. Remember that if you do go for a water-based clay, make sure that it's one that's fairly smooth. Terracotta is going to be better than porcelain, for example, even though porcelain is smooth, but it can't retain its shape very well and it dries really fast. So go for a smooth terracotta if you can find one. For reference, I'll be using some photographs of a nose that I took. You can find these reference photos by looking for model packs on my website. You can also use photographs of your own nose or photos of someone else's nose that you've taken or found, of course. You can also use plaster casts, particularly the David's nose is a cast that's easy to find and buy and should be fairly cheap as well. I have some links to that as well on my FAQ post over on Patreon, and the post is, as I said, free. Instead of starting by sculpting a nose straight out of the board, I'm going to build myself a bed of clay that I can use to build the nose out from. Having a clay bed or base beneath anything that you sculpt, be it a figure or a nose, can be really helpful, as what will often happen is that some mistake will occur where it's easier to fix said mistake by adjusting something downwards rather than upwards. If there is no room to do so because we have a hard wooden board and not a bit of clay, we sort of get stuck and we have to move many things usually up instead of one thing perhaps down. An example that will illustrate this is if you imagine the calves on a figure, the lower leg, being too short. If we can move the feet down, we will get longer calves. But if the feet are on a hard surface, we can't move them down and everything above the calves have to move up. And of course, there's a lot more above the calves than what is below it, below the calves. This would be difficult to achieve, so building a clay bed below your sculpture affords us some flexibility in case we make a mistake that we'll need to fix, and we will almost certainly make some mistakes here. We don't need a lot of clay, just enough to cover the nails and then a little bit extra. The nails are sticking out of the board a few centimeters at most, and really just keep the clay nose from sliding around on the board. The clay will hold itself pretty well, or hold itself upright pretty well once we start sculpting, and we won't need an armature inside the nose, all the way to the tip of the nose, for example. But in case your clay sculpture dries a bit, the nails will keep the clay nose from being dislodged from the board and falling off. They will sort of lock it in place, even if it accidentally dries out a little bit more than planned for. First, we have to decide on the scale that we are going to sculpt the nose in. This is important because once we begin sculpting, it helps if we already know this. Otherwise, the scale could end up random, which would actually be fine, but measuring ensures that the nose fits on the board and we don't accidentally make one that's too big or one that's really small. I do suggest in this scenario making a nose that's bigger than life size, since a real life nose is actually pretty small, and this can make them very difficult to sculpt. In this scenario, I chose to take my own nose and double its length, so essentially twice life size. Now the reference is not of my nose, but as you'll see, it won't really matter as the scale itself ultimately doesn't matter. Only the relationship between the chosen heights and the chosen widths matter. We will make an arbitrary decision about the scale, which is the height measurement, twice the length of my nose, and then work using comparative measurement to figure out the rest of the proportions based on the chosen height of our nose. To clarify the terminology here a bit before we lean into it too much, by heights I'm talking about the heights when the nose is standing upright. Sometimes that means that my heights will turn into left and right, for example when the board is laying flat on the table. I'll still refer to the heights as heights in these scenarios so that we don't get confused. The depths are always going to refer to the depths from the front view. So we'll talk about depths from the side view, but when the board is laying down and we're working those depths become up and down, of course. But I'll still refer to them as depths. Widths refer to widths from the front view. This means widths are depths when observing from the side view, but we'll still refer to them as widths. This way, we're always dealing with the same terminology, even if we are observing from different points of view. As you can see, I'm going to start sculpting with this board laying flat on the table. This means that my nose will be laying on its back. This doesn't really change anything other than that it makes it a bit easier logistically to sculpt this, with less props in the way to prop up my board, for example, while working. And the terminology will remain just the same as we discussed. We will begin by sculpting the profile or the contour as observed from the side view. We can do this, and we start with this feature because the contour of the nose from the side view is essentially traveling down the center of the nose. This makes it very easy to build a contour or a profile, as I'll sometimes call it, as we know this profile exists in the middle of the nose in a straight line. This profile is the same way that I would begin sculpting somebody's full portrait, for example. There are important reasons for starting like this, so let's cover some of them. We start with the profile because certain things are less flexible than others. The least flexible element we'll deal with in sculpture of all kind is going to be heights. Remember that while this profile travels left to right, we're thinking and using terminology like if the nose was upright in its natural state of being. So heights are very unforgiving, and making changes to the heights is going to become difficult. These changes become especially difficult when there is widths associated with the heights. Currently, we'll be working on a really thin, pancake-like profile that will have the heights represented on it, but no widths. This means that the heights remain very flexible and easy to change and adjust. And we're going to need that in the beginning, as we're likely going to have issues setting up the heights perfectly right off the rip. It will take many iterations to get them right, and before they're pretty close to being right, we don't want to have widths added to any heights. Reject the urge to add widths at all costs in the beginning, no matter what you are sculpting almost. With nothing there, it can be hard to know how to proceed or even how to begin sometimes. A good start is to look at your reference and find something that you can use to split the long distance of the profile into smaller parts. Perhaps look for the halfway point between the top of the nose and the bottom of the nose. Perhaps take the tip of the nose from here to here and count how many times it should fit into the length of the nose. The overall length, that is. or rather the overall height, I should say. Measuring like this is comparative measurement. We have a set distance, a set height that we are going to fill with our nose. Then we need to divide that height into parts to make it easier for ourselves to navigate and build an accurate profile within that height. Anytime you have to travel from A to B in sculpture, find some way to split A to B up into smaller parts and then use that to fill A to B with clay. It doesn't even have to be that accurate, frankly. As long as we're able to get somewhat close, we'll be fine, and we'll be able to use our eyes to further adjust from here. Comparative measurements are by default somewhat inaccurate. This is actually a good thing. It means we'll finalize the measuring using our eyes, but we can't do so without getting pretty close. And that's what comparative measurement achieves for us.